Welcome to Game of Attention. I'm your host, Becca Ventham. Today we're talking about creative effectiveness, which is being talked about everywhere. It is a massive thing that brands are trying to achieve on a global scale. How do we do it? How do we do it for less money? And how do we make sure that it lands with the consumers in the right way? There has been some research where 80% of marketers deem creative quality key to marketing effectiveness, and 60% of marketers have increased their focus on creative in the last year. We've seen this across B2B and B2C, as well as D2C. And today, to discuss the impact of creative effectiveness and some smashing campaigns, I've got Katie and Leigh. Could you let us know a little bit about yourself, please, Katie?
My name is Katie. I have been working in the spirits industry for the better part of over a decade. About 8 years client side, and prior to that, 5 years agency side. Working on some really major global brands. I'm currently working at Campari, based in Milan, and I'm originally from Toronto, Canada.
I myself have a few years behind me in digital marketing strategy. So I've worked for a few sort of MarTech companies, helping to sort of maximize value of the platform through strategic initiatives, I suppose, across omni-channel strategies, working with some really good high street retailers here in the UK and also globally. Customer success manager, sort of started at Dragonfly about 3-4 months ago.
Great. Thank you both so much for being here. Katie, can I ask you about the first question? So, Kahlua, Heineken, and Dettol have been highlighted for having some really impactful campaigns recently. What do you think are the commonalities and differences in their approaches that contributed to their great success?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as soon as I watched all of those campaigns, immediately the first similarity between all three brands was around the emotional connection. A lot of those three campaigns were very much based on humor and tapping into emotional storytelling to really connect with consumers. So that was the first thing that really stood out for me, as did the brand tone of voice. The brand, were making light of themselves, which immediately, draws consumers in and makes them feel comfortable with the brands. And thirdly, they also shared very memorable creative. Very disruptive visually, quickly paced, particularly Kahlua and Heineken. And they also used really good audio and voiceover to really hook in the viewer. So those were sort of the top three similarities that I found. And then the differences, the first thing that stood out to me was absolutely the budgets. Dettol, for example, clearly had a lower budget, but it is still very memorable at the same time, whereas Kahlua brought in Selma. I don't know how much they would have paid for that, but it would have been a pretty hefty price tag, I would imagine. And then Heineken, on the other hand, had quite large production and a heavier cast, and editing, sort of post-production editing side of things. So for sure, the budget stood out for me. And then also around messaging. So Dettol was very special. Whereas Heineken was all about, top of mind, celebration, and then Kahlua, which, being in the spirits industry, I love that they're going after a very specific drinking occasion, which is, winning share from wine. So those really were the similarities and differences that I found with those three campaigns.
I think similar to you, Katie, I really did see that they were strengthening that brand to consumer connection and memorability through emotion. Absolutely. And really clever in their delivery and creative storytelling as well. Something that really stood out for me that was across all three campaigns is how they aimed to sort of tackle some current social issues in a really creative way, but also, at the same time, kind of having to aligning with their brand strategy. I think for Heineken and Kahlua, both brands play on that sort of sociability aspect, and they're driving that strong sort of emotional connection. They're igniting joys, similar to what Katie was saying. It's a really sort of immersive experience when you watch those ads that kind of I think Kahlua in particular injects excitement, don't they? And Selma, like you mentioned, although probably high cost aspect, but for her to face this campaign, her presence doesn't really just like ooze energy and excitement. She has that element of sort of cheekiness and playfulness, which can really help you get behind, the proposition. But I think what's really key for me around the Kahlua aspect is, the current challenge that we're facing at the moment is financial. Consumers are becoming a little bit, tightening their purse strings, a little bit more conscious, and they're coming up with a great solution to the problem. So entertaining at home, for one, how it can be a joyful experience, a treat. So I really felt that when I saw that ad. I think both of them, both Heineken and Kahlua, play on FOMO, so fear of missing out. There's that element of, I want to be a part of that. Kahlua, it has a history of being perceived, apparently, as a bit much for the sort of everyday consumer. So I think what it kind of inspired or excited me about this concept is they just tackled it head on. Can't be too much to have Kahlua, as a celebration, in your home. Thinking about mixology and how that's sort of come to play in the market as well. So they're playing around with different concepts. One thing I want to mention just very quickly about Heineken, when we look at the last few campaigns that they've sort of promoted or published, one in particular stood out for me, and it was the Cheers to All Fans campaign last year. I don't know if you guys saw that. But basically this was the social swap experiment, and I thought this was genius. So basically they had two neutral pundits. So they had a man and a woman, and they secretly switched their social accounts. So they had the man speaking on the woman's account and had the woman speaking on the man's account. And what they were trying to do is sort of highlight how women's opinions are unfairly dismissed in football, and leading to sort of toxic environments. And the results came back. It was a huge kind of uproar about it, but the results came back and basically confirmed that women still received, I think it was about 5 times more online abuse than men.
That aspect of playing on stereotypes has really benefited their creative, I think. And one of the other ad campaigns that they did a few years ago was around the stereotype that women order cocktails and men always order beer. And I don't know if you remember this ad, but it was, it pinned women and men standing at the bar and a bartender automatically giving the woman a cocktail and the man a beer. And the two protagonists sort of look at each other and swap drinks and get a cheers, being like, women actually drink beer too. And I think that's a really valid point around.
I would have to be out of the cocktail.
As am I living in Amsterdam, and I tell you, I drink high quantities, not with lastly, of course. But it really is the beer capital of the world, right? And that's where Heineken was born. And also there is an aspect of that cultural Dutchness, I think, that comes through subtly in the Heineken brand around like fearlessness and going against stereotypes. And so I think the brand really is very true to itself in a lot of its messaging and in a lot of its creative.
And similar to Kahlua, where they were trying to introduce a little bit more of their sort of Mexican heritage. And again, using Selma was just absolutely superb because she's so relatable to the sort of, Western communities and general markets. So yeah, I see that as well.
One thing that we haven't touched upon actually, which I think is an important similarity is particularly between Dettol and Kahlua is the length of the ads. Which sounds like such a small thing, but to fit something into 15, 20-second ad placement is no small feat for creative agencies to effectively, get mainly messaging across. And I think they did that really well. Kahlua did it very well, super disruptive, and very, very clear on what the messaging was in a 15-second time period.
How do you think global brands ensure that their creative campaigns resonate across different markets and cultures? And what role does creative testing play in this process?
I think it's really about balance. Global marketing is striking that balance between, consistency, but then also making sure that they're appealing to the diverse markets. I think to create sort of cultural connection, brands really need to sort of focus on, ensuring that their creative campaigns resonate across different markets and cultures. So I guess there's a multi-pronged approach to this in terms of strategy, and one of them being obviously just make sure you know your audience. So cultural research is really key and critical in this process, just to understand those sort of nuances, making sure that they're factored into any kind of localized strategy itself. The global sort of big idea is there, but then as it sort of feeds down or trickles down to local markets, they can then have the ability to sort of take that big idea and then slightly sort of tailor it or structure it so that it's more relevant and considered to the local cultural audience that it's reaching. I think it's always a good idea to have a creative toolkit at hand. So that could be at the global level. And what I mean by toolkit is by collecting and, you really making use of data to help inform and drive those decisions going forward. I know like the toolkits that we support, some of the brands that we work with at here at Dragonfly, essentially help, we go through benchmarking exercise and essentially helps us to understand when we're doing creative analysis and determining sort of what attention metrics are, we can then create that relationship between what good looks like. So what is sort of a more prominent driver within the creative so that you can start to have some best practices in play. Local adoption, I think we've spoken about a little bit. Testing, critical, absolutely. Test everything that you can in every space. Sometimes you might want to kind of test a hypothesis or a theory, but yeah, I think it definitely needs to be embedded into that strategy. It might be worth doing sort of creative analysis before bias kicks in, and I think that's kind of one of the offerings that Dragonfly have, is that we have that ability to create an objective view before cultural differences may be impacted. So before you have that sort of, it's the first 2 seconds of what the consumer is doing when they're looking at that piece of creative. What's happening? Everyone's brains are essentially the same up until that point. And then after that sort of first 2 to 3 seconds, then you'll start to go, okay, oh, what is the emotion? What is the sort of specific relationship or connection that's being made? And that can vary by market. So it could be an additional thing to add to the toolkit.
I think in terms of how to really make creative campaigns resonate across various, different markets, different cultures, the starting point of having a high level campaign that's based off of a universal insight is super important. And that can be something as broad as humor, or it can be something more narrow. And I'll use Heineken again as an example. Around the campaign that we were just talking about, the struggle to pronounce their name, to spell their name, the taking light of themselves. So why don't we tap into that in a diverse sort of range of different countries and cultures? So they identified that and then ran with it for a campaign, which again is great because it is a good example of a global campaign that doesn't necessarily need to be adapted by market, because within that campaign, you can target what is your, target markets right off the bat without having to adapt. But if you do need to adapt, obviously it's really great for agencies and brands to have a deep understanding of various cultural nuances, and it can be little creative adaptations in order to make them culturally, relevant, such as Dettol's ad with all of the laundry. In Canada, some of the laundry can be a toque and a scarf or hockey gloves, or something that's very relevant for that market. So that is a little example again about adapting that sort of broader idea in order to fit your cultural nuances. And Leigh, to your point, creative testing, so important. And don't really need to reiterate that, but doing A/B testing across different markets to help identify those elements that do resonate best.
Liquid death. I mean, everyone says about liquid death at the moment. They are flying. But not so much like the cultural thing, but more generational thing, because it is that millennial kind of generation is very Eminem focused. We grew up with Eminem. Eminem's sober, it's water, and it's almost creating a culture of its own.
Yeah, definitely. So I love what Liquid Death is doing. Also from a sustainability lens, they have moving away from plastic water bottles and towards aluminum cans, which is obviously a much more sustainable material, is a big part of their brand that resonates with the Gen Z and the millennial crowd that they're very much targeting. So their product, like it all starts with a great product. And even though it's just water, it's water done in a totally different way from all of the other brands that are out there. It's such a challenger brand, such a disruptive brand. And immediately your brain doesn't go to water when you see one of those ads. You think maybe it is, a really edgy, potentially alcohol-based drink, or something that is a little bit more jazzed up than water. And then the fact that it isn't actually lends to their brand in such a strong way because it in itself, when you find it that it is water, that really, really sticks with viewers who see their campaigns and their ads. And also their ads are so incredibly disruptive. The two grannies, I mean, like as soon as you start watching, they hook you in the first 2 seconds and you end up watching the whole thing, which again is like in this, game of attention is really, really hard to do.
I think as well, like it's very difficult. I spoke with the head of digital media from Arla on one of the recent episodes, and he was talking about challenger brands and how difficult it is for bigger brands to match that kind of disruption because challenger brands have that power.
They have that power and they also don't have all of the, red tape and restraints that, especially when you're, when you're an alcohol brand, you can't be as edgy or out there simply, well, for given reasons, but it becomes way more difficult to, be more of that challenger disruptive brand when you are dealing with something that is government regulated in certain countries, and then also that is a taboo sort of thing. Whereas water, they can do whatever they want. I'm really jealous. Like they have an incredible runway to bring in crazy creativity without worrying about the legal impacts of it. So I do think that the liquid in general really plays into that in a positive way for them.
Looking forward, what emerging trends in consumer behavior, which fits quite nicely with this, actually, do you think will shape the future of creative marketing campaigns? And how do you think brands should adapt to these trends or prepare to adapt?
But the ones I think that stand out the most for me is sort of customer centricity, not necessarily new or emerging, but needs to continually evolve and adapt. Putting the customer at the heart of every decision, really important. A lot of the work that I've done sort of to date in terms of my experience is shaping, sort of omni-channel experiences, making sure that everything is personalized, everything is driven off of some sort of decision or data. And that really helps to ensure that you're getting the right message to the right sort of person in the right context as well. So there's a lot of different levers that need to pull on. Some of the challenges are around sort of consolidating that experience, particularly with some of the massive global organizations. It can be really tricky just to get ahead of, I suppose, that single customer view that can help activate some of that. And a lot of what we've been speaking about today is, the market is changing, consumers are changing, everything is kind of topsy-turvy, a little bit upside down. But again, I think being able to experiment and be brave with introducing new sort of innovations to the process and trying to kind of really push the boundaries to remain competitive is going to be really important.
I love the topic of trends. It energizes me. And I have narrowed this down just 4 particular trends that I think are relevant for all brands right now. The first one is premiumization. And this is a little bit tricky. Leigh, I love what you said earlier about the consumer insight that, a lot of people are starting to tighten their wallets a little bit. Cost of living is going up. And of course, the first thing that you're going to do is, you're not necessarily going to be splurging on that bottle of 100, euro alcohol or a person Louis Vuitton or any of that, right? So it's less about quantity and more about quality. And with premiumization, it's important to straddle, find the balance in your creative around producing something for mass versus producing something for luxury, but always having a bit of that luxury lens applied to your creative, in order to sort of bring you into like premiumization space where all the brands are going. The second one is around personalization. So I mean this more less on an ATL level and more sort of BTL, CRM. You know, when you receive an email, you want your name to be in it. At least me personally, I love getting an email from, from Gucci saying happy birthday, we're thinking about you. And it makes you feel seen and heard by that brand when that aspect of personalization is brought in. I actually led gifting and brand experience for Diageo's Reserve portfolio when I was living back in Amsterdam. And personalization was a big aspect of this, which is, again, it's tricky to personalize, but at the same time, when we do it well, it adds so much value to your brand. The third trend is all around experiences. We talked about this before already, but this is the experience generation. Millennials and Gen Zs are wanting to spend their money on experience versus product. So how can brands tap into making their brands and products more experiential focused? And in order to sort of draw that crowd in, because it's a growing trend that is not going to be stopping anytime soon. So that's an important one to consider. And then lastly, big trend, AI. Everyone's talking about it, as we know. But in terms of like creating marketing campaigns, how can we lean into AI as a creative generator? Not something that we're worried is going to be stealing jobs, but maybe we'll be creating jobs instead. Yeah, there are really interesting things that are already popping up within these trending spaces. So following along with those and making sure that you integrate them into your brand is, to me, invaluable.
Something you said actually sort of really resonated, and I thought of an example. So when you're talking about personalization and just making sure that everything is sort of tailored to get the most benefit or reaction from the customer, L'Oreal did a really, really great sort of concept project where it relied heavily on the data that they captured so that they could personalize, but so specific. So they created an environment that you could, you could tell a little bit about yourself, your skin type, complexion. What it would do then is it would sort of create almost like a profile of yourself. And then it makes recommendations as to which styles, colors, and things align more to your preferences or skin tone or complexion. But what was really brilliant about L'Oreal is that they introduced this, obviously mass audience, as a TV ad with a QR code at the end. Then you could scan the QR code, which then links straight through to the form to talk about yourself, which then you can either get an email or personalized experience if you go onto the e-com website. And I just thought that was really, really clever, a great way of using first party data, and a personalized experience.
Such a good example, Leigh. And I think touching upon the beauty industry, they're really at the forefront of that personalization in so many ways. And yeah, it's a great example that you just brought up.
On the premiumization?
Premiumization.
That is a tough word.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. But it made me think, I saw in the news recently, Coty are diversifying into dollar stores. And I think making that kind of, it's not your L'Oreal or your Gucci but it is making that kind of luxury brand available to everybody, regardless of your pay packet. And I think that's a really masterful thing going forward. Last question. What advice would you give to brands looking to achieve the perfect blend of creativity and effectiveness in their campaigns?
I love this question. And the first thing I want to mention, which a lot of brands will love or hate me for, is being consumer first and brand second. I cannot stress enough how often, sitting brand side for 8 years now, I think that brand teams are very inclined because they love their brands, they live them, breathe them day in, day out. I think that what ends up happening though is you become a little bit numb to who you're actually marketing your brand to. And this is such a simple tip, but consumer centricity is everything, and it should be at the forefront of all the creative campaigns that are created, in my opinion. The second is around authenticity and being really, really true to your brand. I wanted to touch upon a bad example of this, which is that good old Pepsi commercial with Kendall Jenner, where they were trying. Do you remember this?
Yes.
Like the protest ad. And I mean, that caused such a storm because it was so out of touch and inauthentic in so many ways, from the casting to the execution. Whereas a good example was actually Body Form, the period insomnia. I really loved that. I mean, as a woman who suffers from really bad periods, it resonated so much with me. And it was a really good application of being really authentic and true to your brand and being consumer first at the same time. Like, that could not be more consumer first to me. The third piece of advice is around disruption through the line. And a good example of a disruptive brand now is Jacquemus. I am obsessed with everything that Jacquemus is doing. They're a luxury fashion brand, a French brand, and they are so edgy, so cool. They just, if you check out their Instagram, the yesterday, they opened a new boutique here in Italy, and they did just such a cool sort of stunt marketing campaign, and have trickled down into their digital, and they're really pushing digital as well with their disruptivity as sort of the first channel of consideration as opposed to TVCs. So we're seeing a lot of that as well with sort of the disruptive campaign side of things. And then also, this is probably the more boring one, but around, I already touched upon it, channel considerations. So not necessarily just leaning into ATL anymore, but also really considering the frugal line. So how does your ATL and BTL play together? What's your consumer journey? And also, of course, leaning into proximity media and different things that will really sort of close that consumer journey. So those are my 4 pieces of advice.
Just to kind of bring it back to the ultimate goal, in my perspective, is whether or not audiences are going to find that content or that ad or that campaign memorable. We know that memorability is powered by emotion, and emotion can lead to connection. Connection can then lead to loyalty. So a lot of the campaigns we've spoken about today, some of the Kahlua campaigns, going back looking at some of the Heineken campaigns, they all completely resonate. They are all hitting that emotion button where you're either feeling joy or you're feeling safe or you're feeling excited. And I think that's what it's all about over and above everything. In order to get there, I suppose, a lot of the things we spoke about is just being very considerate of your audience. So, what data do we have? How do we personalize? How do we use those insights to really structure our communication strategy in a more sort of fluid and relevant way? And again, just coming back to innovation and continuous experimentation. I love a bit of innovation. It can be scary. Often it can be, it may not necessarily be sort of cost effective in the beginning, but the outcome is massive in terms of competitive positioning for brands. So I think that's mostly just continue a cycle, experiment, watch, learn it, pivot, launch, monitor, and then optimize. And so the cycle continues.
I know we've mentioned some brands that we admire and some that are really shifting the mold, but in terms of creative effectiveness specifically, what's your kind of top brand that you're like, yes, they get it right every time at the moment?
Coca-Cola for me. I think the one campaign in particular, and this plays to what we were speaking about earlier, in regards to sort of tailoring messages and content for local audiences. They had an open happiness campaign. I don't know if anyone saw that, but it basically tailors the campaigns to reflect sort of things like that are happening locally, like festivals, just ensuring that a little slice of that is incorporated within the campaigns, which I think is really clever. I mean, Nike, we can't go through an exercise like this without, introducing Nike as a key player and differentiator in the space. I think one of the things that stood out for me for Nike is their, ability to really showcase and empower sort of athletic capability. But what they're doing is they're collaborating with local athletes to get feedback into what's important to them, and what sort of differences, and again, those nuances that need to be considered. And then I think just a cheeky one is McDonald's. I know that they do tailor menus based on, sort of regional demand, and they have a lot of fun while they do it, great storytelling. So yeah, I think those would be my top three.
For me, not to sound redundant, but honestly, Jacquemus can do no wrong for me right now. And I think even with their influencer strategy, with their tone of voice, with all of the disruptive activations and experiences and experiential that they're really driving with their brand. I don't know if you saw in Paris, they created a vehicle shaped like one of their signature bags, and they just drove it around and captured amazing content. It sounds like it could be a bit hokey, but the way that they're doing it is just so spot on. I really can't speak more highly of whoever is behind that brand. I mean, like, hats off to them. And I do recommend everyone go follow them. I do not work for Jacquemus, so this is genuine, genuine love for this brand. And then of course Nike, I think, also comes to top of mind. I think that they, in general, they always hit it out of the park in terms of, staying true to their brand, the right partnerships. They actually did a partnership with Jacquemus recently where they created a really, really cool collab new shoe, which I would very much like. Actually, and Loewe did a really good athletic wear collab recently with On Cloud. This is a lingerie, not quite lingerie, but their pseudo premium trainer shoe. And they did this really, really fantastic collaboration with Loewe. So I think a lot of my examples are very much like bringing the luxury industry sort of a little bit more to the masses, but not in shove it down your throat way. And a brand I think that's getting it wrong right now is actually Louis Vuitton. They can come for me, but I think it's really, and this is more around price points, to be honest. We haven't really touched on price points, but Louis Vuitton is selling, their bags these days for on average 3,000, 3,500 euros. But to me, they're so mass luxury that why is as a consumer, would I want to buy something that hundreds of thousands of other people have access to? Why would I spend that money when I can spend it, on a really cool Loewe shoe collab, or, on a Bottega Veneta purse that is the same price, but it is much higher quality and more, more rare and more sparse. So anyway, I could talk about sort of the luxury industry in another session if you do want to have a call with that. But yeah, those to me are sort of my gold standard brands to sort of look towards.
I think it's really interesting because the kind of overlap of Nike there is interesting because Nike is it's just one of the top ones that's never, I don't want to say never got it wrong, because it has got it wrong on some occasions, but the overarching theme is that they get it right. I really admire Flow. I think that the ability to reach into every kind of relationship, every kind of, whether it's endometriosis, PCOS, infertility, they hit the mark for everyone and they get it right. And they haven't pissed anyone off doing it. How?
Such a good one. I love Flow. I'm a Flow girl through and through, really.
Yeah.
That's a really good one. And actually, I have to give a shout out to Apparel. From a consistency perspective, I wanted to touch upon when a brand is so consistent in its creative and also in its strategy, and they're talking about their serve strategy, because the 3-2-1 Aperol Spritz is, being pushed as the lead serve for, over a decade, and the amount of growth that Aperol as a brand has seen through consistency is staggering. And during I was at Diageo, we would look towards Aperol to say, this is what we have to do with our brands. How can we unlock this with our brands? And it's not an easy thing to unlock. But Campari and Aperol specifically has done a really amazing job with that.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's two sides of it. It's consistency, disruption. It's kind of getting it right, being effective, not going too hard, remembering to be authentic. I mean, it's a tough job.
It's very tough, and it's when you get that combination, the magic is amazing for brands, but it's not an easy feat. And it's a constant learning journey, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. I think the challenger brands as well, when they come and shake things up, those consistent brands, if there's any threat to them, the ones that wobble, I'm interested to see kind of how that plays out as these brands get bigger, because Trip is massive. I mean, Trip is like one of the leading beverage brands in the world, as far as I know. And that started from, I think, is it a partnership with husband and wife team? We've now made this giant thing, and any kind of brand to start to feel shaken by that, I'm interested to see what the kind of ripples are. But thank you so much for making the time, and I'm glad that I got to share your insights with our audience, because it's been fantastic to have you.